Madison Square Garden was built for a sport that no longer exists. Not boxing, not basketball, bicycles. For about 40 years, the biggest event in that building was a race where men rode in circles for 6 days straight, and America could not look away. The reason it disappeared is not the one you'd guess. The law that was written to kill this race accidentally invented a brand new sport, one that is still in the Olympics today. Let's go back and see it. Cigar smoke thick enough to blur the far side of the arena. 10,000 people leaning over the rail after midnight. And below them, on a steep wooden track, men who had not slept properly in 4 days. And this is a real photograph. 1900, Madison Square Garden. That crowd came to watch men suffer. It is hard to explain now how big this was. In the 1920s, the 6-day bicycle race was front-page news in the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. Reported attendance at the Garden ran past 100,000 people across a single race week. Movie stars came. Gangsters came. The papers covered it the way they covered heavyweight title fights, and the riders were paid like it. Reported figures from the era put the top man, Alf Gowlett, at $1,000 a day, plus whatever he won in sprints. A rider named Bobby Walthour took $500 to $750. Even a beginner made $100 a day, at a time when a factory worker might make $3. For a stretch of the 1920s, professional bicycle racing may have been the best paid sport in America. So how does something that big vanish so completely that the building it made famous is now known for something else entirely? It started with a very simple, very cruel idea. To understand where it came from, you have to go back further and to a stranger place. In the 1870s, one of the most popular spectator sports in England and America was watching people walk. Not race, walk. Pedestrians would enter an arena and cover as much ground as they could over several days, while crowds paid to sit and watch them do it. And when the bicycle arrived, the promoters simply put the new machine into the old format. The first 6-day bicycle event is generally credited to the Agricultural Hall in Islington, London, in 1878. A professional named David Stanton bet that he could ride 1,000 miles in 6 days, riding 18 hours a day. He started at 6 in the morning on the 25th of February. He collected the bet in 73 hours. And here is a detail that tells you everything about the era. Why 6 days? Why not 7? Because of Sunday. Racing on the Sabbath was against local law and against the beliefs of most of the men involved. So the race ran Monday to Saturday and stopped. The most punishing endurance event of the 19th century was built around a day off for church. 13 years later, the format crossed the Atlantic and found a building big enough for it. 1891, Madison Square Garden. The rules were almost insultingly plain. Ride 6 days. Whoever covers the most distance wins. There were no teams, no shifts, no mandatory rest. A man got on a bicycle on Monday and the clock did not stop until Saturday night. Sleep was something you stole in 10-minute pieces at the side of the track while your trainer counted the laps you were losing. The first Garden 6-day went to a rider they called Plugger Bill Martin. He rode more than 1,400 miles on a high-wheeler, a penny farthing. The bicycle with the enormous front wheel, the one that looks like a museum piece today. 1,400 miles on that. And the crowd loved it so much that within 5 years, the race had a problem nobody had planned for. By the mid-1890s, the men had gotten better, which meant the racing got worse. In 1896, an 18-year-old from Indianapolis entered the Garden 6-day. He was the only black rider in the field. He covered 1,732 miles in 142 hours and finished 8th. The New York Times called him the wonder of the race. His name was Marshall Taylor, Major Taylor, and 3 years later he would be a world champion. Then came Charlie Miller. Miller won the Garden in 1897 and again in 1898. He averaged more than 330 miles a day. In the 98 race, he covered 2,088 miles alone. To beat him, other men stopped sleeping almost entirely. And that is when the report started. Riders weaving into the rail. Riders who could not remember what day it was. riders talking to people who were not in the building, trainers holding men upright on the bike and pushing them back into the pack. One of the great champions of the era, an Australian named L.W, called these races infernal grinds. His description of what they cost was a list, a toll on every muscle in the body, on the stomach, on the heart, and he added on the mind. Miller, for his part, got married at the Garden during that race week in front of thousands of spectators to a woman from Chicago named Genevieve Hansen. Then he got back on the bicycle. That was the spectacle people were buying tickets to. A man in a wedding collar going back out to ride through the night. The papers wrote it up as romance. The New York Times was not charmed. Its verdict in 1897 was one sentence long. An athletic contest in which the participants go queer in their heads is not sport. It is brutality. The state of New York agreed, and it did what states do. Before the century was out, New York lawmakers made it illegal for any competitor to race more than 12 hours in a 24-hour day. Illinois followed. On paper, that was the end of it. A 6-day race cannot run 24 hours a day if no one is allowed to ride 24 hours a day. The promoters at Madison Square Garden did not cancel the race. They gave every rider a partner. One man rides, the other rests. When the rider is spent, he swings his partner into the race with a hand sling, a literal throw, and the pack never slows down. Nobody exceeds 12 hours. The race never stops. The law is obeyed exactly and completely defeated. It debuted in 1899, and it did not just save the race, it made it faster. Where Charlie Miller had ridden 2,088 miles alone, L.W and a partner could ride 2,790. Bigger distances, bigger crowds, bigger money, and the format needed a name, so they named it after the building, the Madison. To this day in French, it is called Course à l'Américaine, the American race. A law written to end a spectacle in New York had invented a discipline instead, which raises the obvious question. If the law didn't kill 6-day racing, what did? Nothing dramatic. That's the uncomfortable part. There was no scandal, no ban, no disaster that shut it down. The sport just stopped being the biggest thing in the building. The Depression took the ticket money first. Boston gave up its 6-day in 1933. Detroit in 1936. By 1938, reported attendance at the New York race had fallen from more than 100,000 to about 50,000, half the crowd gone, and Madison Square Garden had better offers. The Garden's calendar filled with ice shows and boxing and basketball, things you could sell out in one night instead of 6. A race that occupied the arena for a week, for a shrinking audience, was simply worth less than the alternative. Then the country changed underneath it. Americans bought cars. They watched sports on screens instead of from wooden bleachers. The bicycle stopped being a machine of speed and spectacle and became a thing you gave a child. Chicago held out until 1948. New York's last 6-day race ran in 1961, long after the crowds it was built for had gone. Look at what that decline actually looks like on paper. 73 editions of the 6 Days of New York were held between 1899 and 1961. In the good years, they ran the race 2 and even 3 times in a single year because demand was that deep. Then the schedule breaks, no races through the war years, then a long gap through most of the 1950s, then one last edition, won by 2 Swiss riders almost nobody in America had heard of. That is not a sport being killed. That is a sport being forgotten in installments. And then the thing that filled Madison Square Garden was simply not there anymore. Except that it is. Every 4 years at the Olympic Games, 2 riders take turns on a banked track and throw each other into the race with a hand sling. The men's event returned to the Olympic program in 2000. The women rode it for the first time at the Tokyo Games. Millions of people watch it. It is called the Madison. Almost none of them know it is named after a demolished arena in New York City, or that it exists because a group of promoters found a loophole in a law written to stop men from riding themselves into hallucinations. L.W, the man who called it an infernal grind, who came from Australia in 1910, and won 12 of the 24 six-day races he entered, lived until 1995. He was alive to see the sport that made him famous disappear so completely that people watching the Olympics didn't know his event had a hometown. The race is gone. The rule that killed it is gone. The building it was named for was torn down. The only thing that survived was the workaround. If you remember a sport that quietly vanished, tell me in the comments. That's where the next story comes from. I'm Vanishing Era.